It all started on a Tuesday. Tuesdays, in my humble opinion, are the most offensively bland day of the week. They don't have the grim resolve of a Monday or the hopeful glow of a Wednesday. They're just there. And on this particular Tuesday, my bland morning was about to be ruined by the color beige. I was standing on my front porch, nursing a mug of coffee that was just the right side of burnt, admiring my handiwork. My lawn, a chaotic tapestry of clover and grass that hadn't seen a mower in a respectable 10 days, was my pride. But the real masterpiece was the rock garden. To the untrained eye, it was just a pile of rocks. A glorious, mismatched, and utterly deliberate pile of rocks. There was a huge slab of granite we'll call Barry, a monster I'd wrestled into place with a system of levers and profanity. There were smooth, gray river stones, each one a perfect skipping stone for a giant. There were chunks of quartz that glittered in the sun, and porous lava rocks that drank the rain. It was my suburban Stonehenge, a monument to inertia. But it wasn't just a pile of rocks, it was a map. Each stone was a memory, a weekend trip, a story I shared with my late wife, Sarah. Barry was from our 10th anniversary trip to the mountains, a weekend spent in a leaky cabin with a raccoon that kept trying to steal our silverware. The river stones were from a canoeing trip on the Delaware, where I'd managed to capsize us in 2 feet of water. Sarah had laughed so hard she couldn't breathe. She said my look of soggy indignation was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. Every rock was a piece of her, a piece of us, planted firmly in the soil. It was the only gardening I'd ever understood. It was permanent, it was quiet, and it was mine. That's when I saw it. Sticking out of my mailbox like an accusatory finger was a crisp, beige envelope. It wasn't casually placed. It was wedged in there with a kind of passive-aggressive precision that could only mean one thing: the Crestwood Pines Homeowners Association. I sighed, the peaceful coffee steam turning into a puff of weary resignation. You know, when you buy a house in a neighborhood with an HOA, you're signing a social contract. You agree not to paint your house neon pink or raise goats in your backyard, and in return they agree to, well, I'm still not sure what they do, besides cash your checks and invent problems. The envelope felt strangely heavy in my hand, as if weighted with the sheer volume of its own self-importance. It had that specific, soulless texture of cheap office supply paper. I could almost smell the toner and the faint aroma of freshly printed disappointment. I knew, with the certainty of a man who has seen a parking ticket on his windshield, that this was not a friendly neighborhood newsletter. I took it inside, placed it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it for a full minute, as if trying to incinerate it with my mind. No such luck. Finally, I tore it open. The letterhead was oppressively formal. Crestwood Pines Homeowners Association. A community of quality. I always thought the quotation marks were a nice touch, as if even they weren't entirely convinced. The text was a symphony of bureaucratic nonsense. Dear resident of 114 Willow Lane, this letter serves as a formal notice of violation regarding your property, which was observed during a routine community standards inspection on September 10th, 2025. The violation pertains to the unauthorized installation of non-cohesive landscaping elements, specifically the large-scale rock formation in your front yard. This is in direct violation of Bylaw 7, Section 4C, Lawn and Garden Uniformity, which stipulates that all front-facing landscaping must adhere to the pre-approved community aesthetic. I paused to let that sink in. Non-cohesive landscaping elements. They called my memorial a pile of non-cohesive debris. Sarah would have found that hilarious. She would have wanted to get it printed on a t-shirt. The letter continued, getting more absurd with every line. The collection of geological debris presents a discordant visual, and fails to harmonize with the neighborhood's established horticultural standards. Therefore, we require the full removal of the aforementioned geological debris within 30 days of the date of this notice. Failure to comply will result in an initial fine of $200, followed by further financial penalties, as outlined in the community charter. The letter was signed with a prim, spiky signature. Carol Peterson, HOA President. Carol Peterson. I'd seen her from a distance, of course. A woman who seemed to be powered by a small, internal nuclear reactor of pure disapproval. She was always impeccably dressed in shades of beige and taupe, as if she were slowly trying to camouflage herself into the side of a filing cabinet. She drove the official HOA golf cart, the war chariot of crestwood pines, with a ramrod-straight posture, her eyes scanning for rogue garden gnomes and unedged sidewalks. My first instinct was to laugh. My second was to write back, "Dear Carol, Barry the Rock finds your letter to be discordant with his established standards of not being bothered. He will not be complying." But mostly, I just felt a deep, profound sense of annoyance. This wasn't just about a rule. It was about her, about the HOA, trying to sand down every interesting edge of the world until it was all smooth, uniform, and beige. They wanted to take my map, my memories, and haul them away in a dump truck because they didn't match the color of the mulch next door. I looked out the window at my rocks. They sat there, silent and unbothered, just as they had for years. They'd been here long before Carol Peterson and her beige crusade, and they'd be here long after. I crumpled the letter into a tight ball. I walked it over to the trash can and dropped it in with a satisfying thud. It was just a letter. A stupid, meaningless letter. I was wrong. It wasn't just a letter. It was a declaration of war, and Carol Peterson had just made a very, very big mistake. She had messed with my rocks. For 2 glorious weeks, the world was blissfully silent. No more beige envelopes appeared. No ominous golf carts idled by my curb. I'd convinced myself that my act of silent trash can-based defiance had been enough. Maybe Carol had found a new crusade, a patch of slightly too tall fescue grass, or an unapproved welcome mat that needed her urgent attention. I'd started to relax. I'd even given Barry a friendly pat on my way to get the mail. We were safe. This, of course, was my first tactical error. You never assume a predator like Carol Peterson has forgotten you. She doesn't forget. She documents, she files. And then she attacks. The attack came on a Saturday morning. I was in my pajamas, which consisted of an old concert t-shirt and plaid pants with a hole in a place that made sudden bending a risky proposition. I was trying to figure out if a carton of milk that was one day past its expiration date was bravely vintage or certain death when I heard it. A high-pitched electric whine, the sound of a small mammal in distress, or, in my case, the official war chariot of the HOA. I peeked through the blinds. There it was, the golf cart, a pristine white vessel of suburban tyranny parked perfectly parallel to my curb. The door on the driver's side opened, and out stepped Carol Peterson herself. She was a vision in khaki, her blonde hair sprayed into a helmet of immovability. She moved with the stiff, purposeful gait of someone who believes they are on a mission from God, or at the very least, from the zoning board. From the passenger side, a second figure emerged. This was Gary, the HOA's vice president and Carol's chief sycophant. Gary was a small, nervous man who always looked like he was apologizing for taking up space. He scurried around in Carol's wake, clutching a clipboard like it was a life raft. They weren't heading for the mailbox. They were marching up my driveway. This was an escalation, a ground invasion. I quickly downed the questionable milk, live dangerously, I figured, and met them at the door. "Leo," Carol said. her voice a thin veneer of politeness stretched taut over a core of pure steel. She didn't say, "Good morning." That would have implied the morning was, in fact, good, a fact she clearly disputed. "Carol, Gary," I said, giving them a nod. I leaned against the doorframe, trying to project an aura of casual indifference, which was slightly undermined by my holy pajama pants. "We just wanted to have a little chat about the situation," she said, gesturing vaguely towards the yard with a perfectly manicured hand. "The situation?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "You mean the rampant clover? I'm trying a more natural, bee-friendly approach. The bees are very pleased." A muscle in Carol's jaw twitched. "No, Leo, the rocks. We sent you a notice 2 weeks ago. We haven't received a response." "Oh, that!" I snapped my fingers. "Right, the letter. It must have gotten lost in the shuffle. You know how it is. Bills, junk mail, threats of financial penalty from neighborhood committees. It all blends together." Gary shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his clipboard trembling slightly. Carol's smile didn't waver, but it also didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were like a hawk's, scanning my garden for any sign of weakness. "Well, since you seem to have misplaced the notice, we thought a friendly, in-person consultation might be more effective," she said. "We're here to help you achieve compliance." She said compliance the way a dentist says root canal. Something necessary, unpleasant, and for my own good. We walked over to the garden, the three of us forming a deeply uncomfortable triangle of conflict. Carol circled Barry, my prized granite monolith, as if it were a piece of evidence at a crime scene. "This one, for example," she said, tapping it with a single acrylic fingernail. The tink sound was pathetic against the massive stone. "It's quite aggressive." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. "Aggressive? Lady, you have no idea what aggressive is. This is a rock. It loses fights with paper. That's Barry. He's from a quarry up north. He's actually very shy, but he gets defensive when people judge him." Gary scribbled something on his clipboard. He was probably noting Barry's non-compliance. "The bylaws are very clear, Leo," Carol continued, ignoring my defense of Barry's character. "They stipulate a cohesive community vision. This collection creates a visual disruption. It lowers property values." "Lowering property values?" I countered. "My neighbor across the street has a flock of plastic pink flamingos that migrates around his lawn every week. Last Thursday, they were reenacting the Battle of Gettysburg. What about the community vision there?" "The flamingos are under review," Gary squeaked without looking up from his notes. This was the heart of it. It wasn't about rules or property values. It was about control. My garden was something Carol couldn't control, and it was driving her insane. I decided to try a different tactic. The truth. "Look, Carol," I said, my voice softening just a bit. "This isn't just a pile of rocks to me. My late wife, Sarah, and we collected these. Every single one of them has a story. It's important to me. It's my way of remembering her. I watched her face for any flicker of empathy, any sign of human understanding. I saw nothing. Her expression remained as hard and unyielding as the granite she was insulting. "Personal sentiment," she said, the words clipped and sterile. "While noted does not supersede community bylaws. We can't make exceptions. If we make one for you, where does it end? Emotional support sheds, sentimental carports. It would be chaos." The conversation, if you could call it that, was over. She had no intention of listening or compromising. This was a simple exercise of power. "As you failed to respond to the first notice," she said, pulling a fresh beige envelope from Gary's clipboard and holding it out to me, "the first fine of $200 has been levied against your property. A new violation notice has been issued. You have 1 week to comply before the fine doubles to $400, and it will continue to double every week until the matter is resolved. I took the envelope. It felt cold. This wasn't a game anymore. This was real money. Money I didn't exactly have lying around to spend on the whims of a landscaping dictator. They turned to leave, their mission accomplished. They climbed back into their golf cart, the beige conquerors retreating from the field of battle. Just before she drove off, Carol turned to me. She looked from my face to the rock garden, and a look of genuine disgust crossed her features. "Honestly, Leo," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "it's an eyesore. Just get rid of them." And then they were gone, leaving me standing in my driveway in my holy pajamas, clutching a $200 fine. The morning air, which had seemed so pleasant just minutes before, now felt heavy and suffocating. Just get rid of them. The words echoed in my head. It was an order, a dismissal. She wasn't just talking about the rocks. She was talking about my memories, my stories, my little piece of Sarah that I had planted in my yard. And in that moment, standing there in the morning sun, something inside me snapped. The frustration, the annoyance, it all burned away and was replaced by a cold, clear, and slightly unhinged resolve. Oh, I would get rid of them. I would comply with her demand. But I was going to do it my way. And Carol Peterson was not going to like it one bit. The threat of a fine that doubles weekly has a way of focusing the mind. $200 becomes $400, then $800, then $1,600. I did the math on a napkin and quickly realized that in about 2 months, my debt to the Crestwood Pines HOA would rival the GDP of a small island nation. My quiet little rebellion was about to get very expensive. So, for a brief, fleeting moment, I decided to be a responsible adult. It felt weird and unnatural, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet, but I had to try. The path of least resistance, while deeply unsatisfying, was also the path of not going bankrupt. I had to at least explore the possibility of actual, literal compliance. My first step was Google. I typed in rock removal service, feeling a wave of nausea as I did so. The search results were a sea of cheerful logos for companies with names like Rock Begone and Stoneless Landscaping. I clicked on the first one with a decent rating and a phone number. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. "Mike's hauling. What do you need gone?" "Hi," I said. "I need to get a quote for removing a rock garden." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. "A rock garden? You mean like the whole thing? Rocks, pebbles, the works?" "Yeah, the works. Some of them are pretty big." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a heavy sigh. "All right. I can swing by this afternoon. What's the address?" A few hours later, a dump truck that looked like it had survived multiple apocalyptic events rumbled to a stop in front of my house. A man who was built along the same lines as the truck, wide and solid, hopped out. This had to be Mike. He had a clipboard, a sweat-stained baseball cap, and an expression that suggested he had seen all the world's sorrows and was deeply unimpressed by them. "You're the rock guy?" he asked, his voice a low grumble. "I'm the guy with the rocks," I clarified. "Soon to be the guy without the rocks, maybe." He walked over to the garden, his steel-toed boots crunching on the gravel path. He didn't circle it like Carol. He stomped right into the middle of it, kicking at a few of the smaller stones with his boot. He walked up to Barry and slapped his hand against the granite flank. The sound was a dull, solid thump. "Yep," he said, turning to me. "That's a lot of rock." His analysis was both deeply obvious and profoundly true. He spent the next 10 minutes walking the perimeter, making notes on his clipboard, and sucking in air through his teeth with a pained hiss, a sound universally recognized as the contractor's mating call for This is going to cost you." "All right," he finally said, flipping a page on his clipboard. "Here's the deal. The little ones, the river stones, easy. My guys can shovel those up in an hour. But the big fellas—" He gestured to Barry and a few of his larger companions. "That's a different story. To get these out without wrecking your whole lawn, you're gonna need a crane. A small one, but still. You got a crane rental fee, the operator, my crew of 3, maybe 4 guys for the whole day. Then you got the dump truck and the disposal fees at the quarry. They don't just let you dump a ton of granite for free." I braced myself. "So, what are we talking about, ballpark?" He looked at his clipboard, then at me, then back at the rocks. He took a deep, dramatic breath. "To get all this out of here, clean it up, and throw down some topsoil and seed so it doesn't look like a war zone. You're looking at 5, maybe 6 grand. I stared at him. I must have misheard. "I'm sorry, I thought you said $6,000. "I did," he confirmed, with no hint of humor. $6,000? I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "To move rocks that I put here for free with a bad back and a rusty wheelbarrow?" Mike just shrugged, a massive, world-weary gesture. "Look, buddy, it's a pain-in-the-ass job. Simple as that. It's heavy, it's awkward, and it takes time. Most people are paying us to put in rock gardens, not take 'em out. You sure you want to do this? It's a nice garden, got character." His words, meant to be simple observation, landed like a lightning bolt. Here was a stranger, a man who hauled junk for a living, and even he could see it. He could see the character, the effort, the soul of the thing. Carol Peterson, my neighbor, saw only a non-cohesive aesthetic. "The HOA wants it gone," I said, the words feeling hollow. Mike snorted. "Ah, an HOA, say no more." He knew the enemy. "Well, my quote's good for 30 days. Give me a call if you want to pull the trigger." He handed me a business card, climbed back into his apocalyptic truck, and rumbled away, leaving me in a cloud of diesel fumes and existential despair. I stood there, staring at the empty space where his truck had been. $6,000. I could either pay the HOA's extortion fees until my bank account was a smoking crater, or I could pay a man $6,000 to destroy the last best thing Sarah and I had built together. It was a lose-lose proposition. Defeated, I walked back to the garden and sat down on one of the flatter river stones. I leaned back against Barry's solid, unyielding side. The sun had warmed the granite, and it felt solid and comforting against my back. I closed my eyes. What would Sarah do? She wouldn't have let them win. She wouldn't have paid the fine, and she sure as hell wouldn't have paid Mike to tear her memories out of the ground. She would have fought back. But she would have done it with a smile, with a cleverness that would leave them sputtering. I opened my eyes and looked at Barry's jagged, formidable face. I tilted my head. From this angle, with the shadows falling just so, the sharp edges and deep crevices formed a distinct shape. There was a bump that looked like a tightly wound bun of hair, a sharp overhang that looked like a disapproving brow, a jagged line that looked exactly like Carol Peterson's perpetual scowl. And that's when it hit me. Not a spark of an idea, but a full-blown 5-alarm fire of glorious, malicious inspiration. Carol wanted me to get rid of them. The letter demanded the removal of the geological debris. Mike, the contractor, had confirmed it was a rock garden. But what if it wasn't a rock garden anymore? What if it was art? I wouldn't remove them. I would transform them. I would comply with the letter of the law so completely, so artistically, that the spirit of their complaint would be utterly and hilariously annihilated. A wide, manic grin spread across my face. I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying across the screen. I wasn't searching for rock removal anymore. I was searching for custom stone carvers. I was searching for an artist, a co-conspirator, a genius who could see the same thing I now saw in the face of my rocks, I was going to get rid of my rock garden, all right, and I was going to replace it with something so much better. My quest began in the flickering blue light of my laptop screen, deep in the digital wilderness where sanity goes to die. I typed in every conceivable combination of words I could think of: artistic stonemasons, custom rock carving, boulder sculptors, people who hit rocks for money and art. The initial results were discouraging. I found a lot of companies that specialized in identical, soulless granite countertops and tombstone engravings. I saw ad after ad for polished garden benches and bird baths shaped like angels. This was the enemy's art, tame, predictable, and utterly beige in spirit. I needed someone with a bit of wildness, a touch of madness. I was about to give up, to resign myself to a life of escalating HOA debt, when I stumbled upon it. Buried on the third page of the search results was a link with no description, just a simple, unadorned title: Whispering Stone. I clicked. My screen was flooded with a glorious relic of the late 1990s internet. The background was a repeating, low-resolution image of a nebula. The text was a whimsical mix of papyrus and Comic Sans. There was a little animated GIF of a spinning chisel in the corner. It was perfect. The website belonged to an artist named Silas Stoney Stone. The name alone was a testament to his commitment to the craft. The gallery was a revelation. There were photos of intricate stone dragons curled around tree trunks, abstract benches that seemed to flow like water, and my heart leaped, a whole section dedicated to gargoyles. These weren't your standard, off-the-shelf cement grotesques. Each one was unique, carved from natural stone, their faces contorted in expressions ranging from melancholic to mischievous to downright menacing. This was my guy. This had to be my guy. I found a phone number at the bottom of the page, next to a pixelated image of a yin-yang symbol. I dialed, my heart thumping with a nervous, excited energy. It rang 4 times, and just as I was about to hang up, a voice answered. It was slow and calm, a low, raspy drawl that sounded like stones tumbling in a slow river. "You have reached the Whispering Stone? To whom am I speaking?" Hi," I stammered, feeling suddenly foolish. "My name is Leo. I have a unique project. I found your website." "Ah," the voice said. "The digital message in a bottle. It finds those who are meant to find it. What is the nature of your project, Leo?" "Well," I began, "I have a rock garden, and my homeowners association has demanded that I get rid of it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I thought I might have lost him. Then a low chuckle rumbled through the receiver. "Ah," Silas said, his voice rich with amusement. "The beige priests of suburbia. They seek to quell the wild soul of the stone. They demand its banishment. Tell me more, friend. This sounds like a worthy cause." The next day, Silas arrived. He didn't drive a truck or a van. He pulled up in a vintage, seafoam green Volvo station wagon that looked as old and wise as he did. Silas was a man who seemed to be carved from ancient wood. He was probably in his late 60s, with a long, gray ponytail tied back with a leather cord. He wore a faded t-shirt, worn-out jeans, and a pair of Birkenstocks. His face was a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and clear. His hands, I noticed immediately, were incredible. They were large and calloused, with scarred knuckles and dirt permanently etched into the lines of his palms. The hands of a man who spoke to stone through touch. He didn't greet me at first. He walked right past me and into the yard, approaching the rock garden with the reverence of a pilgrim entering a cathedral. He walked around it slowly, his head cocked to one side. He ran a hand over Barry's rough surface, closing his eyes as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "They have good bones," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "A dormant council of elders. waiting to be awakened. Right now, they're a dormant council of code violations, I said. He finally turned to me and smiled. Silas Stone, he said, offering a surprisingly firm handshake. So, tell me of your vision. How shall we wage this war of artistic attrition? I laid it all out for him. The letters, the confrontation with Carol and Gary, the $6,000 quote to destroy it all. I explained my idea of malicious compliance. I didn't want to remove the rocks. I wanted to transform them. She told me to get rid of them, I explained, the words tasting sweet with vengeance. So, I'm getting rid of my rock garden. According to the letter, that's the violation. I'm proposing we turn it into a sculpture installation. Technically, I will have complied. The rock garden will be gone. Silas's eyes lit up. This wasn't just a commission for him, it was a philosophical crusade. Malicious compliance, he said, stroking his chin. One of the most potent forms of artistic protest. Using the oppressor's own words as the chisel, I love it. I showed him the photos I'd discreetly taken of Carol and Gary during their visit. He studied Carol's picture for a long time. He walked over to Barry, the aggressive rock, and looked from the photo to the stone, then back again. Yes, he said softly. I see her in here. The spirit of this stone. It is one of stubborn, unyielding judgment. It has the spirit of a disgruntled owl. I can work with this. He then looked at the photo of Gary, the nervous, quivering second-in-command. He pointed to a smaller, rounder boulder that was nestled near Barry's base. And this one, Silas mused. It has a fearful energy. It wishes only to huddle in the shadow of the larger stone. A sycophant. It is perfect. We spent the next hour walking through the garden, plotting. We weren't just a client and a contractor. We were co-conspirators, generals planning a campaign. He explained the process, the tools he'd use, the time it would take. He talked about finding the face in the stone and releasing the form. I talked about Bylaw 7, Section 4C, and the precise wording of the violation notice. We shall awaken them, Leo, Silas said, his eyes twinkling. We will give them voices of granite and faces of fury, and we will do it all under the guise of perfect, unimpeachable compliance. We shook on it right then and there. His price was a fraction of Mike's removal quote, and the return on investment promised to be 1,000 times more satisfying. As he was leaving, he turned back to me. One more thing, he said. When they confront you, and they will, remember this. You are not destroying a garden. You are merely curating a private art collection on your own property. It is your right. I watched him drive away in his ancient Volvo, a cloud of righteous, creative dust settling in his wake. I looked at my rocks, my dormant council of elders, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't filled with dread. I was filled with a giddy, electric sense of joy. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started, and I had just hired the perfect weapon. The following Monday, the quiet suburban symphony of Crestwood pines, the gentle hum of lawnmowers, the cheerful chirp of sprinkler systems, the distant wail of a leaf blower, was shattered by a new, more aggressive sound. It was the sound of progress. It was the sound of revenge. It was the sound of Silas Stone's angle grinder biting into solid granite. Silas arrived not in his vintage Volvo, but in a battered pickup truck loaded with an arsenal of tools that looked both medieval and futuristic. There were heavy mallets, rows of chisels with tips of varying sizes, power grinders, and a tangle of thick orange extension cords. He laid down heavy canvas tarps around the rock garden, transforming my front yard into an open-air artist studio. The war had officially begun, and it was going to be loud. The neighborhood, of course, took immediate notice. The first sign of surveillance came in the form of Carol Peterson's golf cart. On that first day, she must have driven by my house a dozen times. She'd slow down, her head cocked, a smug, satisfied little smirk on her face. From her perspective, it must have looked like I had finally caved. The noise, the dust, the man with the heavy tools, it all pointed to demolition. She thought she was witnessing the death of my rock garden. She had no idea she was witnessing its birth. My immediate neighbors were a mixed bag. The Hendersons to my left, a young couple who spent their weekends in a state of perpetual, frantic yard work, would just stare from their window, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. They probably thought I was installing an industrial air conditioning unit or digging a missile silo. But then there was Brenda. Brenda lived 2 doors down. She was a retiree in her 70s, a widow with a sharp wit, a love for gossip, and a deep, abiding hatred for the HOA that went back years to a legendary dispute over the approved shade of her mailbox. Brenda was my secret weapon. On the second day of work, she shuffled over, a plate of still warm chocolate chip cookies in her hands. "Leo, honey," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper as she eyed the tarps and listened to the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of Silas's hammer. "Are you finally giving in to that witch?" I grinned and took a cookie. "Brenda, I'm not giving in. I'm complying. Maliciously." I told her the plan. Her eyes, magnified by her thick glasses, grew wider and wider with each detail. By the time I finished, she was positively beaming, a look of pure, unadulterated glee on her face. "Oh, that's delicious," she cackled. "That's the best thing I've heard since they tried to find Frank Henderson for having weeds that were 3 inches tall and a swarm of angry bees chased them off his property. I'll keep you posted on the chatter. Consider me your spy on the inside." From that day on, Brenda was my loyal informant and chief morale officer, providing me with baked goods and invaluable intelligence on the HOA's movements. The days fell into a comfortable, noisy rhythm. I'd bring coffee out to Silas in the morning, and we'd survey the work. He was a man of few words while he worked, but his actions were eloquent. He'd circle a stone for an hour, just looking, touching, running his hands over its surface. Then, with a sudden decisiveness, he'd pick up a tool and make a cut, and a flake of stone would fall away, revealing something new underneath. Our conversations were a strange mix of the practical and the philosophical. "You think you can get that little sneer she does?" I asked one afternoon, watching him work on the fine details of Barry's emerging face. Silas paused, wiping dust from his brow with the back of a gritty glove. He squinted at the stone. "A sneer is easy, Leo. A sneer is just contempt. What she has is more complex. It's the arrogance of the assured, the smugness of the small-minded. You can't just carve that. You have to feel it. You have to understand the soul of beige." He picked up a tiny chisel and tapped it gently. Tink, tink, tink. A minute fleck of stone fell away from the corner of the granite mouth, and suddenly there it was, that signature look of utter disdain. It was perfect. "You, my friend," I said with awe, "are a poet of petty revenge." He just smiled. "The stone tells the story. I'm just the translator." The work continued for over a week, mostly hidden from view by a large tarp Silas had erected to contain the dust, and, more importantly, to build the suspense. The curiosity in the neighborhood was reaching a fever pitch. Carol's drive-bys became more frequent, her expression shifting from smugness to a kind of confused impatience. She couldn't understand what was taking so long. Demolition should be quick and brutal. This was slow, deliberate, and artistic. Brenda's reports came daily. Carol asked Gary why the work was still going on at the monthly standards meeting. She'd text me. "He said he didn't know, but that he saw you bring the workmen a sandwich yesterday and you were both laughing." She was not happy. Finally, the day came. The main piece, the Ode to Carol, was complete. Silas had been working under the tarp all morning, putting on the finishing touches. He'd called me out around noon. "I believe," he said, his voice quiet with satisfaction, "that she is ready to greet the world." Together, we walked over to the shrouded figure of Barry the Rock. My heart was pounding. I'd seen bits and pieces, of course, but I hadn't seen the full, finished product. With a theatrical flourish, Silas grabbed a corner of the heavy canvas. "Behold," he whispered, and pulled. The tarp slid away, falling to the ground in a dusty heap. And there she was. I gasped. It was better, so much better than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just a caricature, it was a masterpiece. Barry was gone. In his place was a magnificent, terrifying gargoyle. The jagged lines of the granite had been shaped into a scowling, snarling visage that was, without a shadow of a doubt, Carol Peterson. Silas had captured her essence. The tight, helmet-like hair was rendered in rough, textured stone. The eyes were deep-set and judgmental, seeming to follow you as you moved. The mouth was a thin, tight line of perpetual disapproval. He'd even managed to carve a delicate, stony version of the pearl necklace she always wore. She was beautiful in her ugliness, a triumph of spiteful artistry. I started to laugh. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a deep, gut-busting, cathartic roar of laughter that I couldn't control. I laughed until tears streamed down my face. I laughed for every beige envelope, for every condescending remark, for every dollar of the threatened fines. Silas stood beside me, a proud, quiet smile on his face, like a father watching his child take its first steps. "So," he said, "you think she'll like it?" I wiped a tear from my eye and looked at the stony face of my tormentor, now a permanent fixture in my yard, forever guarding my home against the very evil she embodied. "Like it," I said, my voice choked with laughter. "She's going to absolutely, positively, 100% hate it, and I can't wait to see her face." The unveiling of the Carol Goyle, as I'd started calling her in my head, did not go unnoticed for long. The glorious, scowling monument sat in my front yard for approximately 3 hours before the first shockwave hit. I was inside, making a sandwich and admiring my new guardian through the kitchen window, when I saw Brenda's power walk of purpose. She was moving at a clip I hadn't thought possible, her arms pumping, a look of grim excitement on her face. She didn't even knock, just pushed the door open. "It happened!" she panted, holding up her phone like a trophy. "I was on my porch pretending to read, and she drove by in the golf cart. She slowed down, did a double take. Leo, the sound she made, it wasn't quite a scream. It was more of a gasp, like she'd been stabbed with an icicle of pure rage. She slammed on the brakes so hard Gary almost flew out of the passenger seat." This was better than television. "And?" I prompted, handing her a glass of water. "And she just stared at it for a full minute," Brenda continued, taking a gulp. "Her face went from white to red to a kind of purple I've only ever seen on an eggplant. Then she peeled out of here. I'm telling you, you've broken her. You've broken the witch." Brenda's report was confirmed an hour later by the arrival of another beige envelope. This one wasn't placed neatly in the mailbox. It was jammed in there, crumpled and angry. The text inside was a departure from the usual sterile corporate speak. It was frantic, unhinged, and filled with bolded, underlined, and italicized words. Formal demand for immediate removal of unapproved statuary. The letter screamed. It accused me of creating a mocking effigy and engaging in targeted residential harassment. It was a masterpiece of sputtering, powerless fury. I framed it and hung it in my office. But Carol wasn't done. A furious, typo-riddled letter was one thing. When I failed to immediately take a sledgehammer to my new work of art, she escalated to her final, Nuclear option. She called the cops. I was watering my patch of clover when the squad car rolled up. It didn't use its siren, but its slow, deliberate arrival had the same effect. Curtains twitched up and down the street. The Hendersons peered out their window, their faces pale with terror. Brenda was on her porch with a fresh cup of tea, perfectly positioned to watch the drama unfold. 2 officers got out. The first was young, with a fresh crew cut and a ramrod-straight posture. He looked like he'd just graduated from the academy yesterday and was determined to handle everything by the book. This was Officer Miller. The second was older, with a weary, grizzled look and a mustache that had probably seen more action than Miller had. He leaned against the car with a sigh, his expression one of profound resignation. This was Officer Davis. "Sir," Miller began, all business, his hand hovering near his notepad. "Are you Leo Maxwell, resident of this address?" "That's me," I said, setting down my watering can. "Everything all right, officers?" "We've received a complaint, sir," Miller said, avoiding eye contact and focusing on a spot on my driveway. "A complaint regarding an offensive statue." I followed his gaze to the magnificent Carol Goyle, who seemed to scowl even more menacingly in the presence of law enforcement. I put on my most innocent, bewildered face. "Offensive?" I asked, my voice dripping with feigned surprise. "You mean my gargoyle? She's a classic architectural feature, a guardian, meant to ward off evil spirits. I'm just trying to protect my home. Is that against the law now?" While Miller looked flustered, trying to find a page in his mental rulebook for supernatural home defense, Officer Davis slowly walked over to the statue. He circled it once. He squinted at the stony face, then glanced across the street to where Carol was standing on her porch, her arms crossed, watching the scene with an expression of vindicated fury. Davis looked back at the gargoyle, back at Carol, back at the gargoyle. And then it happened. His shoulders started to shake. He brought a hand up to cover his mouth, but it was no use. A low snort escaped, followed by a wheezing chuckle he was desperately trying to suppress. Miller shot his partner a horrified look. "Davis!" Davis just waved a dismissive hand, turning his back to me to regain his composure. "Sorry," he coughed. "Allergies." I knew an ally when I saw one. I decided to press my advantage. I produced a copy of the original HOA violation notice. "You see, officer," I said to Miller, handing him the paper. "I was instructed by the Homeowners Association to get rid of my rock garden, which I have done. This is no longer a garden of non-cohesive geological debris. This is a private art installation, on my private property." Miller read the letter, his brow furrowed in concentration. "So, you're saying you complied with the notice?" "To the letter," I said proudly. "The rock garden is gone. This is a sculpture, a single cohesive sculpture." Davis, having finally stopped shaking, rejoined the conversation. He addressed Carol, who was now creeping closer across her lawn. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice laced with a humor he wasn't even trying to hide anymore. "Is this the statue you're referring to?" "Yes!" Carol shrieked. "It's a hideous, mocking effigy of me. It's harassment." Davis stroked his mustache, thinking. "Well, ma'am, I'm not an art critic, so I can't speak to the likeness. But as far as the law is concerned, there's no law against owning an ugly statue. And frankly, your dispute seems to be with his compliance with your HOA rules, which makes this a civil matter." He turned back to me. "As far as I can tell, he got rid of the rock garden like you asked." The look on Carol's face was indescribable. It was a turbulent storm of rage, frustration, and the dawning horror of utter impotence. She had fired her biggest cannon, and it had bounced harmlessly off my granite shield of malicious compliance. "So you're not going to do anything?" she sputtered. "There's nothing to do, ma'am," Davis said, tipping his hat. "Have a nice day." He gave me a slow, almost imperceptible wink, and he and Miller got back in their car. As they drove away, I saw both of them laughing in the front seat. It was a total, complete, and glorious victory. I had won. I had the law, or at least one very amused cop, on my side. I looked at my gargoyle, my stony guardian, and gave her a salute. Then I looked at Carol, who was still standing on her lawn, sputtering like a broken sprinkler. I gave her my friendliest wave. She responded with a glare that could curdle milk and stormed back into her house. The battle was won, but I had a feeling the war was far from over. Publicly humiliated and legally thwarted, Carol did what any cornered, power-mad suburban dictator would do. She called an emergency meeting of the Homeowners Association. The official email, sent out that evening, was a masterpiece of controlled panic. It cited an urgent matter of community aesthetic integrity and unforeseen challenges to established bylaws. I, of course, was not invited to plead my case. This was to be a trial in absentia, but I had something better than an invitation. I had Brenda. She arrived at the community clubhouse armed with a notepad, a fully charged phone, and the righteous fury of a woman who had once been fined for planting unauthorized petunias. She was my eyes and ears, my spy behind enemy lines. My phone started buzzing 10 minutes after the meeting was scheduled to begin. Brenda, 7:10 p.m. Okay, I'm in. Carol is at the podium. She looks like she's about to pop. Her face is the same color as the raspberry vinaigrette they serve here on potluck night. Me, 7:11 p.m. Excellent. How's the turnout? Brenda, 7:13 p.m. Packed. Everyone wants to see the fireworks. Gary is handing out glossy 8x10 photos of your gargoyle. He looks terrified, like he's distributing state secrets. Me, 7:14 p.m. Oh, I hope he got her good side. A few minutes of silence passed. I paced my living room, imagining the scene. Brenda, 7:18 p.m. She is losing it. She just used the word abomination 3 times in one sentence. She's talking about property values and the sanctity of the community charter. Someone in the back just laughed. I think it was Mr. Henderson from Unit 12. He hates her ever since the bee incident. Me, 7:19 p.m. Go, Mr. Henderson. Brenda, 7:22 p.m. Okay, here we go. She's proposing an emergency bylaw. The immediate prohibition of any figurative or representative sculptural works exceeding 24 inches in height, especially those bearing resemblance to current or former board members. Me, 7:23 p.m. That is ridiculously specific. Is that even legal? Brenda, 7:25 p.m. Who cares? People are arguing. Mrs. Gable from down the street just stood up and said if you have to tear down your gargoyle, she should be able to keep her ceramic frog playing a banjo. Carol told her the frog was tacky, but not overtly hostile. Brenda, 7:28 p.m. OMG, it's happening. The rebellion is spreading. People are bringing up all her old grievances, the approved shades of beige for exterior paint, the mandatory shrub height, the time she measured Frank Henderson's weeds with a ruler. This is better than daytime TV. The meeting, which was supposed to be a swift condemnation of my artistic endeavors, had backfired spectacularly. Carol's obsessive crusade against my gargoyle had become a catalyst, a rallying point for every resident who had ever felt the sting of her petty tyranny. She hadn't just picked a fight with me. She had picked a fight with anyone who dared to own a colorful wind chime or a slightly non-regulation birdbath. The seeds of revolution were being sown in the community clubhouse, all thanks to a grumpy-looking piece of granite. While Carol was busy losing control of her beige-tinted empire at the clubhouse, Silas and I were preparing the coup de grace. The emergency meeting was a perfect diversion. All eyes were on the political drama, leaving our stage, my front yard, blissfully ignored. Under the soft glow of my porch light, Silas was putting the finishing touches on his second masterpiece. He'd been working on it quietly for the past few days, and now it was time for its debut. This was the smaller, rounder boulder that had huddled in Barry's shadow, the one Silas had identified as having a fearful energy. "It is done," Silas announced, stepping back from his work. He wiped a fine layer of stone dust from the figure's face with a soft cloth. There, immortalized in stone, was Gary. The likeness was uncanny and heartbreakingly pathetic. Silas had carved him with wide, terrified eyes and an open mouth, as if in a perpetual state of silent scream. Most brilliantly, he had positioned the Gary Goyle just behind and slightly below the main Carol Goyle. Its stony little hands were carved to look like they were desperately clinging to the back of Carol's granite form, the very picture of a sycophant seeking shelter from a world he was too timid to face. It was the perfect punchline. Just as we were admiring our handiwork, a white van with a local news station logo pulled up to the curb. My heart leaped into my throat. "Is that—" I started. Silas just smiled. "Brenda is a woman of many talents," he said. "She mentioned she might make a call." A reporter with impossibly perfect hair and a cameraman hopped out. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica, strode up my driveway, her microphone held like a scepter. "Leo Maxwell?" she asked, a bright, predatory smile on her face. "I'm Jessica Hale with Channel 8 News. We got an anonymous tip about a unique dispute with a local HOA?" Her eyes fell upon the two gargoyles, now standing proudly side by side. Her professional smile faltered, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated delight. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's even better than the tipster said." The camera started rolling. The bright light flickered on, illuminating my front yard like a movie set. A few neighbors, drawn by the commotion, started to gather at a respectful distance. Jessica turned to me, her microphone ready. "So, Mr. Maxwell, can you tell us the story behind these incredible sculptures?" This was it, my moment. I took a deep breath and gave the camera my most earnest, heartfelt look. "Well, Jessica," I began, my voice steady. "The Homeowners Association simply asked me to get rid of my rock garden, and as a law-abiding member of this community, I was happy to comply." I gestured to the gargoyles. "I believe in neighborhood beautification, and I wanted to replace the garden with something that had a little more character. My late wife, Sarah, would have loved them. They're guardians, you see. They really bring the community together, don't you think?" I glanced over at the small crowd of neighbors, many of whom were now openly grinning and giving me subtle thumbs up. The performance of a lifetime. The story aired on the 10 o'clock news. The headline they chose was pure gold. HOA president gets stoned. Local man's creative compliance goes viral. They ran with my neighborhood beautification angle, contrasting my earnest interview with shots of the furious HOA violation notices. They even interviewed a few of my neighbors, including Brenda, who gave a wonderfully shady soundbite about how some people just can't appreciate true art. The effect was immediate and glorious. By the next morning, my house was a local landmark. People were driving by slowly, pointing, and taking pictures. A car full of teenagers even stopped and applauded. The story was picked up by a few blogs, and for a glorious 48-hour period, the Gargoyle guy of Crestwood Pines was a minor internet celebrity. For the HOA, and for Carol Peterson specifically, it was a public relations cataclysm. The news story painted her as a petty, ridiculous tyrant. The HOA's Facebook page was flooded with laughing emojis and critical comments. Faced with overwhelming public ridicule, the board held another, much quieter meeting. The emergency bylaw was unceremoniously scrapped, and all fines against my property were retroactively dropped. I received a short, terse letter informing me of the decision, with no apology, of course. That would have been too much to ask. The real justice came a few months later, at the annual HOA board election. Carol Peterson, who had run unopposed for 5 years, was challenged for the presidency. Her challenger? Brenda. The campaign was short and brutal. Brenda ran on a platform of common sense and fewer beige envelopes. She won in a landslide. Her first official act as president was to repeal a dozen of the most absurd bylaws, including Bylaw 7, Section 4C. The story ends on a perfect autumn evening, about a year after the first letter arrived. I was sitting on my front porch, sipping a cold beer. Beside me sat Silas Stone, who had become a good friend. We were looking out at the Gargoyles. They had weathered nicely over the year, gathering a fine patina of moss and lichen that made them look ancient and wise. They were no longer just symbols of my defiance. They were part of the landscape, my guardians. "You know," Silas said, taking a long sip of his own beer, "they've really settled into the place. They look like they belong here." "They do," I said, a genuine smile on my face. The garden of memories was gone, but in its place stood a monument to fighting back, to creativity, and to the enduring spirit of my wife, who would have found the entire saga absolutely, side-splittingly hilarious. I raised my bottle in a toast to the stony, scowling face of my former tormentor. "To Carol," I said. Silas clinked his bottle against mine. "And to Gary," he added. I took a sip of beer and gave the gargoyle a little wink. The war was over. Peace, quiet, and a healthy dose of beautiful, stony spite had been restored to Willow Lane. And it was good,